Press a button, get perfect focus. If only it was that easy. But great, sharp photos take a little more than that. Luckily, with my tweaks and techniques in this video, you're on a fast track to get great results. Did you know that tilting your mirrorless camera on an angle can actually help you acquire focus in many situations? If not, now you do. And I've got many more tricks to help you nail focus and capture razor sharp images. As photographers, our job is to help the autofocus and camera as much as possible. Because if we do, we are rewarded with the best results. That's why dialing in the correct settings is a great first starting point and very important. I've made many setup videos over the years to help you to set up your specific camera, and I've also linked many PDF setup guides for you down there in the description so you can dial in those perfect settings and get yourself a good head start. I'm Wegener, and for over 20 years I've dedicated myself to capturing unique bird photos and videos and helping others just like you to create your own masterpieces. One technique I love using in the field, especially for flight shots, but it can help you basically in any scenario, is to go from wide to tight. And this method actually includes 2 steps. I said it in the past and I say it again here. The less our camera and autofocus actually have to search for our subject, the better our results will be. So pre-focusing on an area with a similar distance to where you expect your subject to show up is very important. And this is the first step of my method. However, with long lenses in particular, and if the action is moving very fast, it can still be very tricky to actually find our subject in that viewfinder. And this is why I love using zoom lenses for birds and flight photos in particular, because here part 2 of my method comes in. First, I pre-focus on the distance that I expect the bird to appear in, and then I zoom out to maybe 200 or 300 millimeters. And now I have a really nice and wide field of view to find the bird. So when it actually shows up in front of me, I lift the camera to my eye, and because I'm zoomed out, it's very easy to now find the subject. And once I found it in the viewfinder, I quickly zoom in to frame it properly. This technique of first zooming out to find the subject and then zooming in to frame it will basically make it impossible for you to not find the subject. If you're using a prime lens, zooming out obviously doesn't work. So here's something else that I would do in that case, and I actually do the same with zoom lenses as well. And that is to not shoot too tight when it comes to birds in flight and action photography. I would, for instance, leave a teleconverter off, or if I'm using a prime lens, maybe step back a bit more, or on a zoom lens, zoom out a little bit. Because when you're framing your subject too tight, it's much harder for the camera to track it, and it's also much harder for you to keep it in the viewfinder, giving you worse autofocus results. And I'm willingly accepting that I will have to crop a little bit afterwards, because having the subject smaller in my frame also makes it less likely that I'll lose it from my viewfinder, or for instance, clip a wing. Now, clipping a wing is not the end of the world, and with my techniques that I teach you in my masterclasses, it's actually easy to fix, but in an ideal world, I don't want to have to do any heavy editing. Another reason that shooting a little bit wider works quite well is that it simply makes it easier for the autofocus to check your subject, and sometimes even if it jumps from the head onto the tail or part of the wing, for instance, if you're not super tight, the depth of field will still cover the rest of the body of the bird as well. Whereas if you're shooting super tight and the autofocus jumps from the head onto the wing or the tail, oftentimes the rest of the bird is already autofocused, and that is not ideal. Many cameras, and in particular older mirrorless cameras and DSLR cameras, also struggle when the background behind your subject suddenly changes, and horizon lines are probably one of the worst culprits here. I'm sure you've all experienced it. You're tracking a bird, maybe an eagle coming down to fish. You're focused on it, it's coming down for the dive, and the moment the background changes from the sky to the tree, for instance, your camera loses focus and you're left with only out of focus images, which is super frustrating. So my tip in this case, or whenever your camera is about to lose focus or is losing focus, is to instantly stop focusing. Let your focus button go and then try to refocus. That usually gives you the best odds of the camera finding a subject again and you ending up with at least a few sharp images. If you hold your focus button down, chances are it will never acquire the subject again. So whenever there's trouble with the focus, let it go and then press it again. And in the case of our changing backgrounds, we can actually use this to our advantage because we know that whenever we cross the horizon line, we might be in trouble. So my tip here would be to focus on the bird, and whenever you see the horizon appear in your frame, let the focus go quickly, but keep going with the bird in your viewfinder, and once it's in front of the new background, keep focusing again. So basically this method allows us to just cut out the struggle zone for the camera and get good photos before and after. One crucial step in the life of a photographer that many of you neglect or even ignore is image editing. And in my opinion, that is a big mistake. Because with the right editing techniques, we can not only make great raw files look amazing, but we can also take below average images or photos that don't really look quite sharp and turn them into masterpieces ready to be shared with the world. No matter whether you're a beginner or pro or stuck somewhere in the middle, I would love to help you to make editing a fun and rewarding experience, and of course teach you many amazing tricks and techniques you probably never heard of that will have a big impact on your editing life and workflow. So if you want to get fantastic results from your own raw files, I'd highly recommend that you check out my next generation Photoshop and Lightroom masterclasses. In there, I teach you step by step and in easy to follow chapters everything you need to know in Photoshop and Lightroom to get amazing results from your own raw files, even if they don't look great to begin with. But you won't just be watching. I'm also providing you with my own raw files that I'm working on in the class so you can edit right alongside me. And if you're not sure if my classes are the right fit for you or worth it, check out the amazing reviews that I get on a daily basis from many people who have already helped to transform their editing lives. So if you want to turn editing from a frustrating chore where you don't really know what to do or what sliders to pull to a rewarding experience where you end up with an easy to follow workflow and fantastic results, make sure to check out my classes down there in the description. In the past, I've always said that I leave the image stabilization on when I'm doing birds and fly photography and usually on mode 1. And I'm still doing that in most cases because it gives me a nice and stable viewfinder that helps me to track the birds. But recently, when I've been doing more takeoff shots with pre-capture, I've started to turn off the image stabilization for one specific reason. Because the problem with image stabilization in this scenario is that it tries to stabilize the image and basically keep it in that one spot. So if the subject suddenly starts taking off and I'm panning with the subject, the image stabilization still tries to keep me in that spot where I focused on initially, waiting for the bird to take off. And this problem can result in basically the bird instantly flying out of my frame, even though I'm panning with it. So if you're trying to take shots of birds taking off, especially with pre-capture, I would first recommend that you shoot a little bit wider because then it's easier to keep it in a frame. But you can also try to turn image stabilization off because that might help you to more instantly pan with the bird and keep it in the viewfinder for longer because you're not fighting the image stabilization, kind of trying to stabilize your image and kind of delaying your panning movement. So this is definitely not something that I do all the time because I find it harder, especially with longer lenses, to keep the subject in the viewfinder if the image stabilization is off because I'm shaking a lot more. So in many occasions I still leave it on, especially if I have a big bird just flying past me. But if I'm shooting small birds that are on a perch and I want them to take off and get those flight shots taking off, turning off the image stabilization here has definitely helped me to be able to quicker pan with them and keep them better in my viewfinder. What autofocus area or field or zone you're using can also have a dramatic impact on your results and overall autofocusing experience. And especially if you're shooting Nikon or Sony mirrorless cameras, using a smaller zone or area for instance and directing that onto the bird can help tremendously in getting better autofocusing results because it signals the camera what you actually want to focus on. So basically, the more clutter we have around our subject, the smaller of an autofocus area or zone we want to use to get the best possible results. Whereas if we have a bird on a nice open perch or bird on the water or bird flying in the sky or against a not too busy background, I like to use a large zone or the whole area or wide area autofocusing because in most cases, the new mirrorless cameras will quite easily find our subject and then track it all over our viewfinder. I wouldn't recommend using just a single autofocus field or very small zone or area for birds in flight because it's simply too easy to slip off your subject and then focus accidentally onto the background. And I like to use two different back buttons, one assigned to a small area and one assigned to the whole area tracking, giving me the best of both worlds with just a simple click of one button. But even with the best autofocusing tricks and techniques, we sometimes still focus past our subject and onto the background. And this is problematic because cameras like to focus forward rather than backwards. So once you're stuck on the background, it's very hard to get your camera to jump back onto your subject, especially if you're using a mirrorless camera. So we have to use a few different techniques here to bring the focus back in front of our subject so we can nicely focus on it again. And my first go-to here is simply the manual focus ring. In the camera settings, I set it to be always active, and then whenever I get stuck on the background, I quickly just grab the ring, rip it around, and bring the focus closer again to me so that I can then use the autofocus that jumps back onto the subject. The other option is, for instance, to use the spot autofocus, and instead of trying to focus on my subject, which often doesn't work, I look for something in the ground or a tree that's in a similar distance to my subject, basically like pre-focusing. I focus on that, anything with strong contrast basically, and that brings me back into the same distance as my bird or my subject, and then I can autofocus nicely on it again once I put it back into my viewfinder. And there's actually two more methods we have, not on all cameras and lenses, but on most of them. The first one is the focus recall button or focus recall settings button. And that's often a button on your lens that you can program to a certain distance. And then there's either a ring or another button on your lens that you can press once you've registered a certain distance. So if you know that the bird will always show up in a similar area, it's fantastic to just pre-focus, save that settings, and then just press the focus recall button, and the camera will always jump to that distance, making it very easy, for instance, if you're stuck on the background, to jump back to the subject. And lastly, what's very handy for birds in flight, what most lenses also have, is a focus range or focus limiter setting on the lens itself. That, for instance, lets you set the focus range. And if you know that the birds are always far away from you, for instance, you can set the range to go from like 10 or 15 meters, like 30 foot, to infinity, rather than starting at like 3 meters or 10 foot, which means that then the lens has to search less of a distance, making it easier for it to quickly jump onto the subject. The only word of warning here is do not forget to switch it back after you've done your birds in flight shots, because it has happened to me that I set it to like a large distance to infinity, and then suddenly a little bird landed right in front of me and I couldn't focus until it dawned on me that I had actually set the focus limiter to only start focusing at like 10 meters or 30 foot, and I had to switch it back to be able to focus on something that's close to me again. Most cameras also have a setting that's called something like autofocus tracking sensitivity or autofocus response speed, and this is a setting that we can fine-tune if we discover issues with the camera in the field. And the idea here is basically that the more clutter we have around our subject, the slower we want the autofocus response to be, because we don't want it to jump onto something else like a little branch within an instant. So the more clutter we have, the better it is to have the autofocus dialed into more locked on. Whereas if we have birds in flight or a bird flying out in the open or sitting out in the open, setting up a faster tracking sensitivity or faster response speed can help us to stay better and easier on the subject, or if we lose the subject, it also might help the camera to quickly jump right back onto it. So these settings are not really straightforward, and depending on your camera, different settings will cause a different effect. So it's definitely something that you have to play around with. Whenever I do a setup video, I give you an idea of what setting is the best for a certain camera, but generally speaking, just thinking of these settings and knowing that they're there and maybe playing around with them and seeing how your camera reacts can be a good idea. And lastly, it's actually never good to underexpose our images, especially severely underexpose them. But underexposing our images can also have a negative effect on autofocus performance, because a very dark image doesn't have a lot of contrast in it, which makes it harder for the autofocus to identify what's the subject and what you actually want to focus on. So this can definitely be problematic, for instance, if you're in a dark forest or if you're in an extreme sort of backlit situation or shooting into the sun, where you'll notice that the autofocus has a much harder time to identify the subject. So a bit of underexposing is definitely fine, but underexposing your images too much will have a negative impact on autofocus. And on that note, I think it's a good time to wrap up today's video. I hope these tips and techniques will help you in the field to get much better and razor sharp results yourself. And if you do, please let me know in the comments. Also share with me in the comments all the struggles you had when it comes to autofocusing and the settings or the techniques you're using in the field. Also give me a thumbs up for the video, check out my channel membership, my masterclasses, and hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys in another video very soon. Bye!